From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name is David Plyler, and I'm a music specialist at the Library of Congress. And I'm very pleased to be here tonight with some special people. First, we have two members of WinSync, Jack Marquardt, clarinet, and Tracy Jacobson on bassoon. And they're going to be speaking with us a bit about their performance and what they're up to these days. And in particular about the new piece that's going to be premiered tonight by composer Paul Lansky. Paul Lansky is a major figure in, I don't like to say in electronic or computer music because he's a major figure in music in general. And so we're very pleased to have him here because he's doing a lot kind of in all realms of music these days. He just recently retired from Princeton University after teaching there for 45 years, I think. And I'm also pleased to say that his wife Hannah is here, who is who provided the voice for, performed the vocal part in Six Fantasies on a Poem by Thomas Campion in 1973. Is that 68? 78, okay. So luckily I have the sources here to be able to correct me with my frequent errors. But so Paul Lansky was commissioned by the Carolyn Royal Just Fund in the Library of Congress and the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. And he wrote a new piece called The Long and Short of It. So let's please welcome our guests. So I thought we'd dive, we're going to start with a focus on the wind quintet because our players need some time just to get ready before the concert as well. But I'm going to dive into it with wind quintet repertoire. I mean, what you have for the most part is a lot of new music, new transcriptions, things like that. How do you go about kind of building programs and doing the things you do? What is it that draws you to the ensemble?
Well, with this program in particular, we were so inspired by the fact that the long and short of it, the world premiere piece tonight, was inspired by one of the seminal pieces of the wind literature, the Mozart Grand Partita. So what we decided to do was pick three pairs of pieces, three pieces that are standards of the wind literature, Barber's Summer Music, Anton Reicha's Opus 88 No. 2 Quintet in E-flat major, and the Mozart Grand Partita arrangement we'll be doing of the Adagio movement. And we decided to pair each one with a piece that either inspired it directly or indirectly in a way. So with the, obviously with the Mozart Grand Partita, there's the Paul Lansky, the long and short of it. And then with the Maslanka, sorry, with the Reicha, we're actually pairing with who, Anton Reicha was one of the most prolific composers and one of the earliest composers for the wind quintet in the early 19th century. He's often kind of seen as the same way as Haydn was to the string quartet, but only for the wind quintet. So he's kind of the grandfather of the wind quintet. And David Maslanka is one of the most prolific writers today for the wind quintet. So we kind of paired these two, and they're going to bookend the program. And then for summer music, we're actually pairing it with a piece called Winter Music by a contemporary composer named Adam Schoenberg, who lives in Los Angeles. He's in his mid-30s, so he's still kind of young. And it's a piece that he found direct inspiration from. And so that's kind of how we put this program together. More generally, we like to do a lot of our own arrangements. So this program actually only has one of our own arrangements, the Mozart Grand Partita. But generally, you'll find that almost 90% of our programs are our own arrangements, not just of pieces written for winds, but orchestra, piano, string quartet. It really runs the gamut of anything is possible for us to do.
Do all five of you participate in that process, or do you kind of switch roles every once in a while, take the lead?
Well, Jack is our primary arranger, and then once Jack has put the arrangement on the page, it's a very collaborative process from there, where we're taking a pencil or a pen to the part and switching around parts and seeing what really works best for all of us. And once we come up with that, then we perform it and change it all again. And that's one of the really exciting things about our particular experience playing in Wind Quintet, that we have so many performances that we're really able to, in every performance, have a very different experience with the music and be very playful and learn new things about the music every time we play it.
Well, that strikes me as a very convenient scenario to be able to have that ability, to have that flexibility on the fly and make those decisions depending on where you are without causing any too much consternation to the transcriber.
Exactly.
Well, maybe looking at the new piece, the long and short of it, I want to ask Paul about it, but first I want to hear what you have to say about what you see as the relationship between that piece and the Adagio from the Mozart. Or like how does it fit in, how does the inspiration seem to trace to you?
Well, it's very obvious even from the first few notes of Paul's piece, because even just with the tempo marking and the way that it's written, it looks like the Mozart. And there's a particular rhythm that's present in the Grand Partita, which actually, even before we played Paul's piece, we actually played the arrangement of the partita. So we were in that mindset when we first approached the long and short of it. And so when we first began, it was this feeling of familiarity from the beginning, because we were already familiar with this same rhythm. And the melody as well, it references very directly the melody in the Grand Partita, but with some very key changes. And then one of the most exciting things about playing this piece is seeing where it goes differently, and to find those differences. And then with many of the different movements, they're not as directly tied to that original theme and that original kind of motor behind what's going on in the melody. So there's a lot of really interesting wind textures that are very well written for wind quintet. I must say that a lot of wind quintets that we've attempted to perform or attempted to play are not necessarily written by wind players, and they don't understand the need to breathe and some of these things. So we really have appreciated Paul's writing.
So I think what's so fascinating about the inspiration from the Grand Partita is not, one of the beautiful melodies, but it's actually from this accompanimental figure that's so present throughout. And that's the launching point for this whole piece. And I think that is so cool that he's actually taken the heartbeat out of the Grand Partita and kind of injected his own voice to it, whereas a lot of time it's much more of a straightforward inspiration. So it's really amazing to see that heartbeat kind of woven into this really amazing texture of this piece.
Well, Paul, what are your thoughts on maybe the genesis of it? What led you to this idea as having this be kind of a kernel for the start of a wind quintet?
It's funny. I don't really know how it happened. I know the Mozart, and I love the Mozart, and the Mozart always seemed to me to epitomize breathing in wind instruments. You can imagine. Should I use this? You can imagine. String instruments playing this rhythm. The basic rhythm goes bum bum ba-rum bum ba-rum bum bum bum, which is a long note and a short note. And that's the genesis of the title, long and short of it. I think it's an inspired title. And so my idea, I started out, I can't remember where I started out in the piece. I usually don't write pieces in chronological order, things. I think I actually started with the first movement, with the second movement. But the idea behind using the accompaniment sort of as the DNA of the piece, as it were, came pretty quickly. And I had mixed feelings when I heard they were going to play the Mozart, because Mozart does it so well. And but it's okay. It's okay.
Well, one thing about your titles, I've always thought that you have a certain sense of humor similar to Milton Babbitt, with whom you studied, in terms of the kind of clever titles that you have. To get to a point that was made earlier about the writing well for winds, I haven't been able to spend time with the score, but I believe that there's certain focuses on different instruments in the kind of the intermediary kinds of shorter movements. I believe that that's true. And to me, that strikes me as a really smart way to give other players a break, even though I think you're still playing, but, but maybe you can talk to that, or is that something that you're very much thinking about, just knowing that these are going to be, that there's a chops issue as well as other types of things?
Yeah, I thought it would be a good way to exercise the different things that instruments can do. I saved the last one for the clarinet. That's the biggest one. But it's nice that it consists of, 5 short movements. There's a prelude and a postlude and 3 interludes, and 4 sort of main movements, which are slightly longer. And each of the preludes and interludes features one of the instruments. It starts out with the flute, and then I think bassoon is next.
Right.
And then oboe, then horn, and then clarinet. And I thought it was just a nice way to do this because these instruments have different roles to play in lots of wind quintets. So that idea came pretty quickly. And writing the movements, the other movements, was sort of an exercise in trying to have an escape velocity, get something going that got away from the long and short of it. But we'll see how that works.
If I might add, another really great thing for us having these different instrument features is that the wind quintet features these 5 very different sounding instruments that produce sound in different ways and in different ranges. And one thing that can happen is that the instruments get pigeonholed into their range. Particularly, you have the bassoon always playing the bass line. You have the flute always playing the top voice. And to do this in the way that you did, where each of the instruments is featured as a solo voice, it turns everything around throughout the piece, and so the audience is constantly getting to hear different parts of the wind quintet. And so I think it's really exciting, and it makes the piece so much more dynamic as you're listening to it.
So Paul, you're a recovering wind quintet player, right?
I played with, it was sort of one of the highlights of my life, actually. When I was just graduating from college, I got a call from the Dorian Wind Quintet. They asked me to audition for them. I did, and they called me before I got home. And I played with them for a year or two before I went to graduate school at Princeton in composition. But it was great. The horn was a great instrument for me. For some reason, I seem to have a knack for it. And I realized that when my junior high school band teacher gave us each a little audition, and he said to me, "I can see you've been practicing," and I hadn't been practicing. So this has got to be a good instrument for me.
Well, Tracy and Jack, what sorts of projects are you working on now, in addition to giving this premiere tonight and other things that you're up to?
One of the most exciting things that we're doing right now is actually a program of music that's inspired in some way or another by Shakespeare. And so we're looking at all of these different angles of music that was inspired by Shakespeare, and a lot of these are transcriptions, and particularly of Romeo and Juliet. And so, again, we're featuring Jack's arrangements in some pretty exciting capacities. And the other thing in this program that we're doing that's beyond even just Shakespeare is just classical storytelling and looking at the wind quintet as a storytelling instrument in a lot of ways. And so I guess the common thread of this program is that every piece that we're playing tells a story, and in the telling or in the playing of this piece, we're also including the audience in this story. And because Shakespeare's stories are all so well known, it's something that we can all really relate to together.
And also on the horizon this season, we've actually commissioned a concerto for wind quintet and orchestra That'll be getting its premiere in May with the Lafayette Symphony in Indiana, and then next year with the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra in Houston. That's by a young composer named Michael Gilbertson, and so that'll be a really exciting thing to have an entire wind quintet standing up in front of an orchestra playing a concerto.
And the other aspect of what we do, which is pretty substantial for us, is we focus a lot on building classical music audiences, and particularly young audiences. And so we have a project right now which is called the Play Different Project, and again, going with this storytelling theme, we're looking at the wind quintet as a way of seeing 5 individual instruments that look different and sound different, but they play beautifully together, and the music that we create is better than the sum of our parts. And so we look at this as a way to relate to young kids in elementary school, and have essentially created this campaign where we're using a musical performance and actually going into classrooms to create this environment of tolerance and appreciation of differences amongst young people.
So a question that comes to mind with these younger people experiencing a wind quintet for the first time, perhaps, do they have these issues that some composers have, and other about a lack of homogeneity of the sound between the voices? Or I'm sure that they hear when you do things that are like characters and of each individual instrument, but do they have that same sort of bias, or something that they but not in a negative way? I don't mean, but you know what I mean?
Well, I think that actually we work it to our advantage. We have 5 distinct personalities and 5 people who really shine as individuals within the group, and so I think that's the homogeneity of the string quartet is interesting, but I think we allow our individual personalities to shine through a little bit more, so we feel like they get to know us as people a little bit more as well, I think. The kids do, at least.
And we almost become our instrument in a way,
Sure.
which is so neat and exciting to share, and not even just for young audiences, but in general, our personalities really shine through our instruments, and that's not something that we try and dampen in a performance. We obviously want to create a group sound, but we want that group sound to be based on 5 soloists rather than 5 people that are trying to blend initially.
That's a great way to put that. That's really nice. How are we doing on time? I just want to make sure we...
We have 10 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. Why don't we... we'll come back to Paul in just a moment, but while we still have you here, I'm wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about this process of commissioning that you do and how you go about building repertoire.
Well, we've actually commissioned on a few occasions, and one thing that we also do is we try and find pieces that are already written for wind quintet, maybe that someone else commissioned, that have been played once, that type of thing, and that's going to the piece by Adam Schoenberg that we're playing today. And that wasn't actually written for us, but across our careers we run into a lot of composers, and composers that we really like as people and whose music we really enjoy. And we always ask if they have a wind quintet already that we could read and see if we like to perform. And when we're commissioning music and when we're performing music or selecting music to perform, we look for a few key ingredients. I think the most important thing, which fortunately Paul's piece really got quite well, is the playability for wind instruments, because a lot of composers will write for winds without truly understanding the voices of wind instruments and what we can do and how we shine. And so that's one of the main things. We're always looking for new iterations of wind quintet sounds. One of the things that is one of the things about the wind quintet is that our repertoire, compared to the repertoire of a lot of other chamber ensembles, is quite limited. Most composers wrote 1 or 2 pieces for wind quintet, if they wrote anything for wind quintet. And there's some composers that were very prolific for wind quintet, but those pieces are quite similar to each other. And so what we have is a relatively limited pool of repertoire. And so when we're looking for composers that want to add to that repertoire or that have added to that repertoire, we want to find new sounds and things that are really interesting to us. And the other thing that we're really looking for is we're looking for a composer that doesn't just want to write a piece that's based on anything, but we really like music that'll tell a story. And that's been something that's very important to us throughout our careers, because we find that audiences will relate to a piece of new music that they haven't heard before if they can relate to the story behind it. If they can understand where it's coming from even before they've heard it, then that's something that they're going to be able to appreciate without ever having heard it before. I think one of the disadvantages of new music for audiences being connected to it from the beginning is simply that they haven't heard it before. And so that's one of the things that, unfortunately, we can't overcome. We can't send a CD ahead of time and say, listen to this, and come to the concert and hear us perform it. And so we look for ways in the music that we can connect to the audience on an emotional level so that they're able to feel as though they have heard it before in a small place in their heart, rather than having actually heard it before.
By tells a story, are you you're privileging narrative in particular, or more just something about the piece that has a graspable...
A graspable point. So it might be a narrative, but it also might just be the relation to the grand partita. It might be some other graspable, exactly, something that they can hold on to and relate to.
Well, I think it's one thing that I think is a very positive thing that you do, and that I've always thought that there should be ensembles out there that dedicate themselves to the second performance of works, because this is often the plight of composers who will write a piece, it'll be performed a few times or one time, and then it doesn't get picked up because of a particular type of commissioning culture that sometimes is there, which is, it's nice to see though that there are more and more of these co-commissioning consortia that come together to kind of immediately give some pieces a leg up, and that's a nice thing to see too. I guess would there be anything more you'd like to add about the pieces tonight, in particular Paul's piece that we haven't already talked about, before I let you go to just go ahead and get ready?
Well, there's some more really interesting names of the movements.
Oh, actually, yes, absolutely. Please
I
go
thought
into
about adding
that.
them when you were talking about it, but
Please.
So one of the most interesting ones, and it took us a while to really understand, is the second to last movement, which is la di da da di da la da da di da da da, and
Almost.
something like that. And we were looking at it, it's like la di da 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 di da 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 li da da. And so we're trying to figure out, what does this relate to? Where does this come from? And then in the music, there's a passage which is da 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 di da 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 di da da da, and it goes throughout the piece. And so we were just rehearsing the piece, and we'd kind of given up on the name. We hadn't really understood the relation yet. And we were just rehearsing it one day, and we were trying to sing this passage, and it came out as the title of the piece. And so we understood in that moment where it came from.
There's also like a movement called the Joy of B flat minor. Is that right? Or
Yeah.
which has a precedent. I believe you have another piece called the Joy of F sharp minor.
An iconic piece called The Joy of F sharp minor.
Right.
Well, it wasn't in F sharp minor, so this is in B flat minor. So
So it's a series that
I've
could
got
have.
10 more possible.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for talking with us a bit.
Yes,
We'll let you
thank
go
you.
get ready. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the concert very much. Let's give a round of applause for Tracy and Jack. And so I'm going to talk a bit more
No,
with
please.
Paul. Yeah, go ahead.
No,
Oh,
just turn.
Oh, sure. I was mentioning to him earlier that my first introduction to his music was through a composer named Scott Lindroth, who, and I'd forgotten the title of it, but it's Tables Clear, which is a piece from 1990 Speaking of a story element behind it, I believe that at that point it was a recording of your children clearing the table. Is that where the kind of the genesis of that work?
Yeah. Several times. I have two children, Jonah and Caleb, and they're 5 years apart. And several times before that, I just sort of would tap something on a glass, and they'd tap on a glass, and we'd bang some pots and pans, and they'd bang pots and pans. And Hannah would leave the room usually. So one night after dinner, I said, "Well, why not sort of make something out of this?" So I got out a tape recorder, and I set the kids free in the kitchen just to bang on whatever they wanted, and I recorded them. And they were great. Caleb discovered that it hit the back of a pan in a certain way. It goes boing, boing. And Jonah got out his violin and had some pluck notes. And this is the only piece, I think it's the only piece. Well, at a certain point in the recording, Caleb decided to use his own body for noises. So he did armpit farts. And that's in the piece. And he could also burp on demand.
Talented family.
Yeah, I can't do it. I don't know. Jonah can't do it either, but Caleb can do it. And so I'm very proud of this piece. It consists of about 30 or 40 sounds, and I sort of start out with a scenario that could actually really be something that might happen. It's sort of, rhythmic and slow, and it gets faster and faster until it sort of starts to swirl. And it's supposed to be a kind of dreamlike scenario where you get into this swirling world, and then all of a sudden it stops and there's clapping sounds and armpits and things like that. And then there's a big long sustain section which I put in last in the process, and I have at the end Caleb saying, "That'll be the best part." So it's the only piece I know of that uses armpit farts and carries its own commentary. So you can hear it on Spotify or iTunes. Table's Clear, the title comes from A Streetcar Named Desire, where Blanche Dubois asks Stanley Kowalski to clear the table, and he just clears the table. Table's clear.
Well, I bring up that piece in particular because it kind of represents one of many different avenues that you've pursued over the course of your career. And a lot of these, I know that there was this sort of break, that not a break in a negative sense, but a change that happened in terms of where you started to do a bit more non-electronic, non-computer music fairly recently, or starting in the late 90s and then to the 2000s. But before that, you were doing predominantly, I believe, computer music and electronic music, both synthesis and, in this case, taking recordings and then putting them together. One thing I noticed about this music in general, and also with everything else that I've heard that doesn't involve the computer in a major capacity, is that you immediately get a sense of a sound world of a piece from it, of a piece of music. You don't get this, you don't feel like, oh no, here's an electronic piece that's going to be, building for 30 minutes, and I have to, not that there's anything wrong with those types of pieces, but I feel like you build this world very quickly. And one thing I would love to hear you speak about is that process of building that world, because you have such distinctive ways of creating the sounds it's a different type of thing, say, to write a wind quintet than it is to actually, create the sounds from the ground up or collect the sounds and put them together in a particular way. Some of them are more labor intensive. I don't know. What is your experience with that?
Well, I grew up really learning to love music in the 50s and the 60s. And part of what I did was just listen to records. My father actually was a recording engineer. He worked for Capitol Records in New York. And so I spent a lot of time, visiting his recording studio. And so recording in general was very interesting to me. And I realized probably quite early on that as far as avant-garde or experimental or electronic music goes, there's really a sort of a bifurcation of different kinds of uses of loudspeakers. The standard electronic model, the loudspeaker is the instrument. You know, it goes crunch and squeak and squeal and grind and that's sort of, you know, what we come to expect from electronic music. But one thing that I liked a lot was the idea that loudspeakers are windows into a virtual space. Let me repeat that. Windows into a virtual space. So, you know, you listen to a recording, and if the recording is done well, then there's a real tendency of the recording engineer to create the illusion that something is actually happening in the loudspeakers. And I got very interested in doing that sort of thing with electronic music, in creating the impression that there's a world behind the loudspeakers that's functioning that way. And I spent a lot of time working with voice. I used Hannah. I was very lucky to have such a wonderful reader for my pieces. And I spent a lot of time trying to model real instruments and to get the sound of a violin or the sound of, armpit farts. And so most of my pieces, actually I think almost all of my electronic pieces consist of something that is a virtual world of its own. And this became sort of an obsession with me. And then one day I thought, well, rather than synthesize a violin, why not use a real violin? And I had done a lot of things with recording players and using their sounds, but to actually use the real violin in a way that real violinists would appreciate was sort of the point of the exercise. So there's a real, I don't want to go too far afield here, but let me just say really quickly that there's a different kind of compositional conception behind created and frozen in time electronic music and music for instruments. One thing that I like a lot is the idea of danger in music, in performance. So when you hear somebody perform, there's always the possibility that they'll miss a note, that they'll die of a heart attack, that something strange will happen. With electronic music, it's always fixed, and the only thing that can happen really is the tape machine to break down, which has happened actually.
But at the same time, you have these certain times where you have referential things, like say with cars going by or something like that, where you do get this sense of potentially a sense of.
Yeah. So almost all of I think I have one piece that I did toward the end of my time doing this, which is purely electronic, that doesn't reference real-world sounds. But all of the pieces, virtually all of the pieces that I did, consist of some aspect of focusing on reality, some way to sort of peer into a real world. And it was getting old around 2005 or so. With Tables Clear, turned out to be a cathartic experience, and percussionists in particular asked me for a transcription of Tables Clear, and there's no way I can do that. I mean, I used all kinds of random number generators and different things to create the rhythms and textures of Tables Clear. So that got me into writing percussion music, and I've written a lot of percussion music, and it's a different world. I was basically 60 when I started, when I finished doing computer music and started doing this stuff, and it was great. It was like I was beginning again and starting over. So. It's been a really interesting voyage. My one regret is that, let me not go into regrets.
Well, it's there's certain things that you've said that are one thing I'd like to just say about your many of your pieces in general is that there's a great deal of activity there's a lot of things, say with granular types of processes and things like that going on, but they're so controlled, both like in a tonal sense, in many cases a harmonic sense, but also a sense of like you find the pitch material and the other types of things in the types of sound that you're using, and you control them so clearly, even with all this activity. So it feels like there's this great undercurrent of energy that you're kind of suppressing and kind of floating atop. And I don't know if that's just something that's always been a part of your music, or do you think of it that way at all, or probably not?
Well, it's complicated. I did a piece in 1984 called Idle Chatter, which has gotten a lot of play. It was inspired by actually a trip driving into New York City, going through the Lincoln Tunnel, coming out at the end of the Lincoln Tunnel. Some people who lived in New York may remember the days when the mouth to the Lincoln Tunnel was really a pretty seedy place. And came out, and there were a bunch of teenagers, black teenagers, standing around the cop, sort of bouncing up and down. And he had a smile on his face. And I rolled down the window, and they were doing, a rap to the cop, and he was enjoying it. And I thought, what a great idea for a piece. So I went home and started to do it. And I took Hannah's voice and chopped it up into little bits and tuned the bits. And I started to do a real fancy, harmonic thing with all kinds of weird chords. And it just became totally exhausting. So I narrowed it down to an F, everyone doing F. And that sounded good, but got a little old after a while. So I added an E flat. And then I added a D and a B flat, and I had B flat major. And you have to realize that in the late 70s and early 80s, that at Princeton, nobody was taken seriously if they wrote tonal music. We were all sort of experimentalists, and I had done my share of fancy ways of organizing harmony. But I realized that the computer actually freed me up to write tonal music. And I love writing tonal music. I love tonality. I think tonality is one of the great accomplishments of Western civilization. And the piece sort of flowed in tonal terms. And since then, most of my pieces are, in one way or another, diatonic. The piece tonight is very explicitly diatonic. I do other pieces which are more or less diatonic, and so the electronics sort of freed me in a way. So I still got respect, but I could do things with tonality.
Well, one other thing that I've always been curious about, I think people who haven't tried to produce their own electronic music, especially back when you had to rent time at a computer if you were going to have, or just be on the university faculty.
$600 an hour.
Really? Oh wow.
That was the university.
So back in the day when it was really, you had to invest a great deal of time to get any sort of feedback, versus today when you have a bit more of immediate feedback, but not necessarily mastery of, say, if somebody were just to go and look at software, they would have some immediate feedback, but they wouldn't still have mastery of that, how to produce exactly what they want to produce. How does that compare what you were doing in those days versus the way that you approach composition now? Are you thankful that you have that you're a bit divorced from those technological impediments, or was that something that helped the compositional process?
Well, I loved getting under the hood. I actually wrote a lot of software. I discovered, strangely, that I had a knack for writing software. And I did a lot of it, but I always did it in the service of a piece in one way or another. So what was your question? So
the amount of time that you would take just to be able to get to where you could then utilize that software, or...
it was very slow. I'd typically spend a year on a piece. And you mentioned the Six Fantasies on a poem by Thomas Campion, which I did in the late 70s. It took me a year and a half. And it was a very tedious process. For that piece, I could actually work at home with a line at a time monitor, 30 characters a second, which just was transmitting code. And then I'd have to go into school and sign out a digital tape and take the digital tape into a lab which had mini computers. We used Hewlett-Packard's very first computer, and there was noise and whirling, and it was called the D-Day converter. I remember picking my son Jonah up from nursery school one day, and I said, he had a friend I had to take home too, and I said, we have to go to the D-Day converter. And Jonah said, he was, I guess, 5 at the time, maybe 6. He said, have you ever been to a D-Day converter? And I often wondered what his consciousness was like, because he would go and hear his mother's voice transmogrified over a loudspeaker. So the process was fun. I had patience for it, and I seemed to get a lot of music out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But well, it's almost the case that these days, when it's so easy to do, that the sort of fun is taken out of it.
Well, I think in some cases it might be easy to get that start, but it's harder sometimes to hear that mastery that you're presenting in all these pieces over the years. With new projects that you're up to, you mentioned that you're doing some more percussion music. I know that So Percussion, you did a quartet for them. Do you have anything else coming up?
I just wrote a song for guitar and voice about insomnia. And the song is, I wrote the words. The song is called Just Once. And the insomniac says, just once, let me sleep through the night. So.
Is that for David Starobin also?
No, it's for Bill Anderson, from the Composers Guild of New Jersey. And yeah, I have a bunch of other pieces in the. But the nice thing about being retired is that I can devote all my time to it. So it's fun.
Well, that's great. I think maybe we'll open it up to ask if anybody has any questions that they want to ask you.
Yeah, please ask me a question. I'll do what I we used to do with undergraduates. I say, oh, I'm going to hold my breath until you ask me a question.
Have you worked with the Princeton Laptop Orchestra?
Yes, actually, the last piece I did, the electronic piece, was a piece for the Laptop Orchestra. It's called A Guy Walks Into a Modal Bar. It uses something called modal bar synthesis. We had a guy at Princeton named Perry Cook, who was very good at doing what are called physical models. That is, instead of modeling the way the sound works, the way the sound sort of evolves over time, like, you'd have a pop and a decay. It actually isn't, well, for a flute, for example, you have the right going wave and the returning wave and that sort of thing. So I did it with 4 undergraduates, and we did it. I must say, I wasn't thrilled with it. So you sort of, you can do anything in real time now, but this was not my favorite. Ask me another question. I'll hold my breath.
If you wait for him, he'll bring a microphone up to you. Thanks.
Hi. You were talking about tonality, and you used the word diatonic, which I'm, to be honest with you, not very familiar with. Can you explain that a little bit more?
What diatonic means?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you hear a whole slew of notes, and you reference them in one way or another. If you're, I think with Milton Babbitt and George Pearl and other composers like that, they reference them as notes of the chromatic scale. With one thing I love about tonality is that, or using diatonic tonality as a model, is that you hear a note and you think of it as a scale degree. So if I go bum, you can think of that as dum, or you can think of it as the third note of a G major scale, dum, bum, 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 bum. Or you can think of it as the second note of an A major scale, dum, bum, 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 bum. pardon the performance. And when I used to teach tonal harmony to beginners, I would take the Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto, which starts out with a G major chord with a B on the top, and then it turns into B major. So just the ability to locate a note as a place in a scale. So the note has a quality and a meaning that depends a lot on, the tonal context. And I guess the short answer is, when I think of things in diatonic terms, I do think of things as members of as scale degrees. So it's the second scale degree or it's the first scale degree. So the note has a quality. And the wonderful thing about this is, I don't want to go too far afield here, but the wonderful thing about this is it gives you a metric for distance. You do something in G major, it's going to be very far from B major. And the wonderful thing Beethoven does, he jumps from G major to B major and then sort of wanders back to G major. So that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. I did a lot of work in the 60s on new theories of harmony. George Pearl, I collaborated with George Pearl on a thing called 12-tone tonality. And it just didn't work for me. So, but it's fun. Does that make some sense?
I know you've written about like reference versus implication and those types of things, but there's this element of implication that comes with the knowledge of a system and or awareness of a system.
The wonderful thing about tonality is that you can imply things that are going to happen. You do something, and that sort of implies a way of thinking about things, and it implies a way of moving in time. With 12-tone music, it doesn't work quite the same way. Babbitt used to differentiate between the two. He called one a combinational system, which was tonality, and the other a permutational system, which means you're worried about different arrangements of the same set of objects. And that probably confuses you more than anything.
I think we had another question.
Yeah. One thing about composing electronic computer art music is that you don't need a performer, or at least not a living performer. And then you go back to composing music that required performance. I'm just wondering how you felt about suddenly having to have performers involved in your work.
Well, that actually became the focus of my attention, especially with percussion music. When I started to write percussion music, I guess my first real percussion piece was a piece called Threads, which I did in 2005. When I first started to do percussion music, it was very much like doing electronic music. I'd worry about envelope, and I'd worry about attack and decay, and so that felt great. But at a certain point, I lost the thread, pardon the pun, and it started to get mysterious. And then I realized that one of my roles as a composer was to be a choreographer. And with percussionists, that's really the name of the game. I imagined them moving in various kinds of synchronic ways. Is that a word, synchronic? Well, it is now. I imagine them moving in various ways, and like with greased chests and big drums. And when you see a percussion group, there are some percussionists who are like dancers, and so the notion of being a choreographer became part of the whole action. I like that a lot. So I'm actually, a lot of my electronic music had been danced to, but I was never persuaded by it. But looking at a percussion ensemble as a dance troupe really makes it seem quite different.
Just to follow up on that, you had mentioned earlier that a lot of the work you were doing in electronic music was trying to get towards a more realistic sound, like something that was in the real world, but that was created by you. Is there any flip of that? Do you find with non-electronic music that you're writing, do you find yourself moving back in some way towards a different type of ideal idiom or something like that?
Well, it's really different. One thing that I have to admit is that when I was doing electronic music, it was before the days of computer programs that could write your score for you. And I remember spending 6 months writing a piece and spending a year writing the parts, and then hearing it and wishing I could revise it. So the great thing about these programs is that it makes revision possible. And my publisher is very graceful about it, doesn't make too much of a fuss when I say, please throw out the score I just sent you. I've got the revised version. I'm going to probably revise tonight's piece in some way. So if anyone has any great suggestions for ways to revise it, please let me know. It also one thing that it makes possible, which I like a lot, is it makes it possible to compose in out of order. So, you write something and then you say, well, in the middle of that, there should be this, something longer. And actually, the beginning should be different, or there should be an additional part of the beginning. So I don't compose in things in timely ordered ways.
Whereas before you would be forced to put together the program, compile it, and go through that before you get any feedback?
Yeah, it's very different. It's very different. And I'm very glad that I did it. I loved writing electronic music. It was great. I'd go up to my studio after breakfast in my bathrobe and I'd just play with sound. And that was great. And now I can play with sound to a certain extent, except, the MIDI realizations that you do of your pieces always sound so dreadful that you have to know what you're doing. But it's very different. And I love this. One thing I really liked about doing electronic music was the feeling of being in a studio, a pottery studio, or any kind of studio where you fabricate something. And I'm a great admirer of composers who can just sort of write a piece out with a pencil and paper, which I don't do. But I love the feeling of being in a workshop type environment.
Even though you're cloistered, it seems like a performative act to be doing all of that. I don't know. That's to me.
It's true. You're actually, as I said, you're scripting activity for humans to do. So you're not just writing an abstract piece. You're choreographing something that performers are going to actually physically do. So next time you see a percussion ensemble, just watch them. There are two in particular. Eric Chow Beach at So Percussion. He's a skinny little guy, and he looks like he's dancing as he plays the percussion instruments.
We have time for one last question.
I'll hold my breath.
Somebody please. Oh, we have one over here.
So I'm impressed that in the audiophile world, people are going from transistors back to vacuum tubes. And you composed during that period of transition, I would assume, where you started with the amplification was more based on tubes, moving into transistors. Did you sense a lack of warmth as things became so fully digital?
I sort of think this whole back to vinyl is simple-minded. My first experience with the difference between digital and vinyl was with my Campion Fantasies. I did the piece. I spent a year and a half doing it. It was great. I was very proud of it. And I got a recording. It was issued on an LP, on Composer's Recording. It was great. I played it once, and at the end of the thing, there's a loud part, and it sounded awful. sounded nothing like that. I asked my father what was going on. He said it's inner diameter distortion. It's the angle of the needle changes with the as you get to the end of the record. And I noticed back in those days, you know, I still had good high frequency hearing, and I'd listened to a recording once, and it sounded great, and I'd listened to it twice, and second time it sounded less good. Actually, young faculty members at Princeton used to wait at the record library to get recordings of pieces that hadn't been played, so you could take them home and play them for the first time. So I was really not thrilled with the analog world. Also, the fact is that if you made a copy of something, you degrade the copy. So after recording something, you know, recording something, then recording the recording of that, then recording the recording of that, it gets more and more distorted. So I constantly was battling with the problems of analog recording. And the thing I love about digital recording is that you can copy it an infinite number of times. And I think this is you know, a significant difference. So it is, that's not to say that there's not some problem with digital recording. But I think that anything you can do on analog, you can do on digital if you have a high enough sampling rate. Does that make sense?
That was a great answer. Thank you. Let's thank Paul Lansky for speaking with us today, and I hope you all enjoy his piece, as I'm sure we all will.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.